What the walls kept. Part 1. The locked door. She had $1 in a canvas rucksack, and a photograph of a woman she had never met who had been dead for 12 years. The dollar came from the tip jar at Maple Lane Diner, which technically wasn't hers to take, except that she had bussed tables and washed mugs and swept the floor every single morning for 4 years, and nobody had given her a going-away present. So she counted the photograph and the rucksack and that single folded dollar, and she called it even. The driveway had been hers once, for 20 years technically. Her name was on nothing. Her name was never on anything, but she had walked down that driveway 10,000 times, first on small legs, then on longer ones, always heading toward the same school bus at the same stop at the same time. That's what made it hers, not a deed, not a title, repetition. Now it was just a driveway, and she was sitting on a cardboard box at the end of it, watching the October sky go flat and gray over Burlington, Vermont, and understanding that this was the day she had been waiting for since she was 11 years old. Garrett had changed the locks. He hadn't said anything dramatic about it. Garrett never did anything dramatic. He didn't need to. He was the kind of man who made spaces smaller just by being in them, who could make a person feel like they were shrinking without raising his voice above a conversational tone. He said things the way you said the weather, flat, final, not open for discussion. She had come home from the morning shift at the diner. Her key worked on the front door. It had always worked on the front door. She had gone upstairs and turned the knob to her bedroom, and the knob had turned, but the door hadn't moved because there was a padlock on it now. A new one, shiny hardware store padlock, the $8 kind, screwed into the old painted door frame. She had gone back downstairs. Garrett was in the living room watching television. He didn't look at her. "Your stuff's in the driveway," he said. That was it. No argument, no explanation, no particular cruelty beyond the efficiency of it, the way you solved a logistics problem you had been meaning to get around to for a while. She had gone outside. One cardboard box, her clothes, her toothbrush, a book she'd borrowed from the library 2 years ago and forgotten to return, the photograph of her grandmother Marion in its frame, which had been on her nightstand since she was 9 years old and which had survived 11 years of keeping herself small and still in that house. She took the photograph out of the box first, held it. Her grandmother Marion stood in black and white in front of a classroom, a small classroom, not like the schools Lena had been to. One room, wooden desks. Marion Marsh had been a teacher in New Hampshire in the 1950s, and she had looked exactly like someone who had taught in a small room in New Hampshire in the 1950s. Straight back, kind eyes, chalk dust on her fingers visible even in the black and white. Lena had never met her. Marion died when Lena was 8 in a town 3 states away from a heart attack at her kitchen table, but this photograph had been on Lena's nightstand every night of her life in that house, and she had looked at it often in the way you looked at the face of someone who could not be reached, but who felt somehow like the person who would have understood. She put the photograph in her rucksack, against her back, next to her spine. Then she sat on the cardboard box and took out her phone. Her hands were steady, her eyes were dry. She had used up her crying years ago, on nights when Garrett's voice came through the walls with a specific frequency that made everything vibrate, not loud, not screaming, just that particular tone that carried a weight in it, the weight of someone reminding you without words that the space you occupied was borrowed and the terms of the borrowing could change at any time. Those nights she had pressed her face into the pillow and cried without sound because sound was dangerous and silence was survival. She had learned to read a room before she entered it, to know from the set of Garrett's shoulders at the kitchen counter whether speaking was safe, to know from the way her mother moved around the stove, too carefully, too quietly, whether the evening would hold or break. She had learned by 9 years old how much space she was allowed to take up. Not much, and she had gotten very good at taking exactly that amount. There was nothing left to cry now. There was only the box and the driveway and the flat gray October sky and the knowledge that this was always coming. She called Vera Dunn because Vera was the only person she could think of who would come. They had not planned this. It wasn't that kind of relationship. Vera was 74 years old and had been coming into Maple Lane Diner every morning since before Lena started working there, ordering the same thing every time: coffee, black and rye toast with butter on the side, and sitting in the corner booth and reading the newspaper and occasionally saying something to Lena that was funny in the dry way of someone who had been paying attention to the world for a very long time. They had become something like friends, the way you became friends with someone you saw every day without meaning to. The accumulated weight of small moments, the way Vera would push her glasses up when she was reading something she disagreed with, the way she always left a tip that was 30% even when the service had been Lena, the way she had only once touched Lena's hand across the counter when Lena had come in with a bruise on her arm from walking into a door frame at 3 a.m. and had said simply, "I'm here if you ever need." Lena had nodded. She had filed it away. She had never thought she would use it. Vera's Subaru smelled like dog hair and peppermint and something underneath both of those things that was very old and very solid, like a house that had been standing for 100 years. Vera arrived in under 15 minutes. She pulled up to the curb, looked at Lena, looked at the cardboard box, looked at the house, looked at the upstairs window where the curtain was not moving. She got out of the car. She picked up one end of the cardboard box. She looked at Lena. "Other end," she said. They put the box in the back of the Subaru. Vera didn't ask what happened. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything at all until they had driven 6 blocks, and then she said, "Are you hungry?" Lena was. She hadn't eaten since 5 a.m. Vera drove to a diner that wasn't Maple Lane, a different one where Lena was nobody and didn't have to bus any tables. They sat in a booth and Vera ordered coffee and pie and Lena ordered coffee and pie, and they ate in silence, and the silence was not awkward. It was the silence of two people who had been existing in the same small orbit long enough that words were optional. After the pie, Vera set her fork down. She said, "My sister had a schoolhouse." Lena looked at her. "My sister Dorothy, Ruth. She went by Ruth." Vera turned her coffee cup in its saucer. She taught at a one-room schoolhouse in a town called Aldenvale, down in the hills south of here. Taught there for 22 years. The county closed it in 1968 when they consolidated. Ruth died a few years ago. A pause. "The building's been sitting empty ever since the county closed it. They've had it on the surplus list for years. Nobody wants it." "Why is it on the surplus list?" "No electric, no plumbing, no septic. County inspector says there's a crack in the foundation on the north side." Vera picked up her coffee. "They're selling it for $1 just to clear the lien." Lena looked into her coffee. A schoolhouse. She didn't know what that meant exactly. Whether it had a roof that held, whether the floor would take her weight, whether she could sleep there without freezing in November. But she knew what $1 meant. It meant possible. "Where's Aldenvale?" she said. They left at 7 a.m. The Green Mountains of Vermont in October were the kind of thing that made you feel like you had been doing something wrong with your eyes. All that color, gold and red and orange going up the hillsides like something had been set on fire in the best possible way. Mist in the river valleys burning off slowly as the sun came over the ridgeline. Stone walls running along the road, edges stacked by someone long dead who had understood that the world required organization. Vera drove the way she did everything, deliberately, without excess. Lena watched the landscape and didn't say much, and thought about the photograph of Marion pressed against her spine in the rucksack. Aldenvale appeared around a bend in the road like a secret someone had almost kept. General store with a porch, white church with a steeple, cemetery where the stones leaned at various angles like old arguments, a covered bridge over a river, a post office that looked like it had been built by someone who had never quite decided how large a post office needed to be. 300 people maybe less. The schoolhouse was at the edge of town, on a quarter-acre lot beside a stone wall and a hayfield. Lena got out of the Subaru and looked at it, single story, white clapboard faded in some places and peeling in others, slate roof dark gray intact, a small bell tower on the ridge with the bell long gone, tall windows 6/6 panes, each the glass slightly wavy with age, a front door painted dark green faded almost to black, and beside the building a massive sugar maple. Its leaves were half-turned, green at the center, orange and gold at the edges, like the tree was showing its work, like it was in the middle of becoming something and didn't mind being watched. A stone step led to the door. The center of the step was worn down from 100 years of children's feet. Lena stood on the gravel path and looked at the building for a long time. Vera waited in the car. She understood without being told that this was a decision Lena needed to make alone. The general store was also the town clerk's office. Owen was 62 years old, with reading glasses held together with a piece of electrical tape and a quality of stillness that suggested he had been behind that counter for a very long time and had seen most things at least once. He looked at Lena over his glasses. "You know that building hasn't been used since '68. Yes. No electric, no water, no septic, foundations cracked on the north side. I know." He looked at the dollar she put on the counter. He picked it up. He opened a drawer, found a handwritten form, and began filling it out with a pencil. "Welcome to Aldenvale," he said. The interior was exactly what it had been in 1968. Wide maple plank floors, dusty but solid, the kind of hardwood that got harder with age. Plaster walls cream-colored with age. A green chalkboard still mounted on the front wall. A map of the world tacked beside it, yellowed and curling at the corners. Pressed tin ceiling painted white, the stamped floral pattern still visible under 56 years of stillness. 2 rows of wooden school desks, the old-fashioned kind with cast iron legs and flip-up writing surfaces, most of them intact, all of them waiting for students who had become parents, who had become grandparents, who had most of them moved away. At the back, a cast iron pot-belly stove on a brick hearth, chimney pipe running up through the tin ceiling, rusted but whole. Beside the stove, a small cabinet, a few pieces of chalk, a grade book, a bell, the handheld kind, the kind teachers used to call students in from recess. The light in the room was extraordinary. The tall windows on both sides let in long rectangles of October morning sun that fell across the maple floor in warm gold shapes. Dust floated in the light like snow falling sideways. Slowly, without hurry, Lena stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. The room smelled like old wood and chalk dust, and the faint sweetness of maple sap that seemed to come from the floor itself, a smell that had been accumulating for 160 years and had no plans to go anywhere. She felt the history of the space, not as a weight, as a presence, the way certain rooms felt occupied even when empty, because the people who had been in them had left something behind that wasn't quite a sound and wasn't quite a smell, but was something. She walked to the front of the room, stood at the chalkboard. Someone had written the date years ago and never erased it. June 4th, 1968, the last day. She ran her finger along the ledge of the chalkboard. Chalk dust came off on her fingertip, fine and white and still after all these years, exactly what chalk dust was. She said very quietly to the room, "Okay." The north corner was where the plaster had failed first, cracks running from floor to ceiling sections, buckling away from the wall. Lena put on work gloves. she borrowed from Vera's car and began pulling. The plaster came off in large chunks. Behind it lay thin strips of wood nailed horizontally across the wall studs, and behind the lathe the studs themselves, hand-hewn from local timber, rough cut still hard and straight after 160 years. And between the studs newspaper, old newspaper yellowed and brittle, crumpled and packed tight between the studs as insulation. Pages from the Addison County Independent and the Burlington Free Press. Dates from the 1930s and 1940s mostly, before fiberglass bat insulation was common, before anyone had decided that old newspapers were not the ideal material for keeping cold air out of a Vermont schoolhouse in January. Lena pulled the newspapers out carefully, piece by piece, setting them on the maple floor in a pile. Some of them she glanced at, headlines from another era, an agricultural report, a notice about a town meeting, a recipe for something involving suet. She was being careful because they were old. She was not expecting to find anything else. And then her hand touched something that wasn't paper, something metal, flat, rectangular, slightly smaller than a hardcover book. She pulled it free carefully, a tin box, the kind that had once held Christmas cookies or assorted hard candies. It was rusted at the edges, but the lid was still tight. She pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a piece of wax paper that had gone brittle with age, a stack of paper money, old bills, some $5, some $10, folded in half and bound with a piece of string. She counted them. $340. Lena sat back on her heels. She looked at the tin. She looked at the wall. She looked at the tin again. Okay. Stop. Think about this. One tin in one wall cavity, hidden behind the lathe and the newspaper. Hidden carefully, the newspaper packed specifically around it, not randomly, but deliberately creating a kind of nest. Someone put this here on purpose. She went back to the wall. She pulled more newspaper from the next stud bay. Slow, careful. Looking now, instead of just removing, her hand touched another tin. $280 in this one. Next bay, a mason jar sealed with wax. $510 in coins and small bills. The bay after that, a tobacco canister, round, with a hinged lid. $400. Lena worked through the entire back wall that afternoon, pulling plaster and lathe and newspaper, finding tin after tin, each one tucked between the studs at a different height, each one packed in carefully with newspaper around it, like someone had placed them one at a time over a long period of time, adding one here and one there and never in a hurry. By the time she reached the corner, her hands were white with plaster dust and shaking with something between exhaustion and something she couldn't name. She moved to the side walls. More tins, more jars, a wooden box, 2 canvas pouches, 1 sealed envelope. One of the jars held only silver dollars, each one wrapped separately in tissue paper. One tin held a thick roll of $50 bills held together with a rubber band that disintegrated the moment she touched it, the bills fanning open in her hands, like something that had been held together by will alone and had simply been waiting for permission to let go. By the end of the second day, Lena had opened every wall in the schoolhouse, 23 containers in total, distributed through every wall, hidden at different heights, as if someone had spent decades building a treasury inside the skin of the building, one small deposit at a time, in the way you built anything that was meant to last, not all at once, but gradually, with patience, with a belief in the future that never wavered. The total was $29,700. She sat on the maple floor with the money in front of her, and the empty tins and jars arranged around it, and the old newspaper stacked in a pile, and the plaster dust settling on everything like quiet snow. She found the letter inside the sealed envelope. It had been hidden in the wall behind the chalkboard. The last container she opened. She pulled the envelope free, sealed with wax, now dry and brittle. The handwriting on the outside was careful, slanted slightly forward. Written with a fountain pen, the ink faded from black to brown with age. She opened it. The letter inside was written on schoolhouse stationery. The letterhead said, Aldenvale Town School, Aldenvale, Vermont, in small type at the top, and below it in the same careful slanting hand, to whoever finds this. My name is Ruth Calloway. I have taught in this school for 22 years. The county has decided to close this building and consolidate the children into the school in Burlington. I understand why they have made this decision. I do not agree with it, but I understand it. Over the course of my years here, I have saved what I could from my salary. I did not trust banks after what happened to my parents in 1933. I lived simply. I was content. And so the money accumulated in the walls of this building, a little at a time, in the same way that anything worth having accumulates slowly without drama through the practice of putting aside what is not immediately needed. This money belongs to the school. If the school has closed, and by the time you read this it will have been closed for some time, then it belongs to whoever takes care of this building and keeps it from falling down entirely. A schoolhouse is a place where people learn to become themselves. That process never stops being needed. There is one more thing. In recent years, I have been fortunate to correspond with a woman named Marion Marsh, a teacher in New Hampshire, who visited this school more than once and who understood what this place was. I will say only this: if Marion's family should ever come to this place, if a daughter or a granddaughter should find herself here, they should know that Marion helped sustain this work. A portion of what is in these walls came from her sent to me for safekeeping in 1952 when she could not keep it safely herself. She asked me to hold it until it was needed. Feed the next student who comes through the door. Ruth Calloway, June 1968. Lena read the letter twice. She set it down on the maple floor, and then she sat very still with the afternoon light coming through the tall windows in long, warm rectangles, and the dust floating in it, and the 23 empty containers arranged around her, and $29,700 on the floor of a one-room schoolhouse in the Green Mountains of Vermont. Marion's family, a daughter or a granddaughter. Her name was Lena Marsh, and her grandmother's name had been Marion Marsh, and her grandmother had been a teacher in New Hampshire, and there was a photograph in the rucksack that Lena always kept against her spine of a woman with kind eyes and chalk dust on her fingers in a small classroom. She reached into her rucksack. She took out the photograph. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she got up and went back to the pile of old newspapers on the floor. She had been stacking them without reading them, pulling them from the walls quickly. She started going through them now, carefully, page by page, looking for something she didn't know she was looking for. Third stack from the left, a page from the Addison County Independent, dated October 1956. The paper had been folded around itself and packed into the wall cavity with a tin in the third stud bay from the left on the back wall. At the bottom of the page, a small photograph, black and white, the kind of photograph local newspapers ran at dedication ceremonies. Two women standing in front of a library building, one of them identified in the caption as Ruth Calloway, Aldenvale, the other identified as Marion Marsh, visiting teacher from New Hampshire. They were standing close together. They were not looking at the camera. They were looking at each other. And they were smiling in the way people smiled when they had been talking for a long time and had found the conversation worth having. Lena looked at the woman in the newspaper photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the photograph from her rucksack. The same jaw, the same straight back, the same way of standing, which was the way of someone who had been in many classrooms and had learned that how you stood in front of people mattered. Same chalk dust on the fingers. Even in the newspaper photograph, even in 1956, her grandmother Marion had been here, had stood in this county, had stood beside Ruth Calloway, had visited this school more than once according to the letter, had sent money to Ruth Calloway for safekeeping in 1952, had asked Ruth to hold it until it was needed. She pressed both palms flat on the maple floor, the way you put your hands on something solid when the ground under you had shifted. The wood was cool and smooth and very old. It held. Outside, the sugar maple moved in a small wind that Lena couldn't feel from inside. Its leaves, half orange and half gold, turned and settled and turned again against the October sky. The schoolhouse had been waiting since 1968, which was, Lena understood now, exactly as long as it was supposed to have been waiting. She said very quietly to the room, to the letter, to the photograph of the two women smiling at each other in 1956, "I'm here, Marion. I found it." The afternoon light came in through the tall windows and fell across the maple floor and the old tins and the money and the newspaper and the letter from Ruth Calloway and the photograph of her grandmother, all of it warm and still, all of it waiting to see what happened next. Part 2. The cost of staying. The first thing was the stove. Before the plumbing, before the electricity, before any of it, the cast iron pot-belly stove in the back corner of the schoolhouse had been sitting there since 1968 with its chimney pipe running up through the tin ceiling and nothing to show for itself except rust and the memory of what it used to do. A chimney sweep drove out from Middlebury. He had the look of a man who had seen every variety of chimney neglect that Vermont could produce and had made his peace with all of them. He ran his brush through the pipe. He inspected the damper. He looked into the firebox with a flashlight and said, "You've got creosote, but not much. Bird nest at the top, but I got it. Stove itself is solid." He drove away. Lena bought a cord of seasoned maple from a farmer down the road, a man named Will, who delivered it in his truck without asking too many questions. She stacked it on the porch and brought 3 logs inside and opened the draft and built a fire with the newspaper she'd pulled from the walls, not the important ones, not the ones she'd set aside, but the plain ones, the ones without photographs or headlines she needed to think about. The fire caught slowly. Then it found its confidence. Then it stopped being tentative and became what it was supposed to be. The stove heated the room in under 30 minutes. The pressed tin ceiling held the warmth and radiated it back down, the way tin ceilings always did, which was one of the things 19th century building knew that the 20th century forgot. The long windows let in the last light of the October afternoon. The maple floor began to lose its cold. Lena sat on the floor with her back against one of the old school desks and watched the heat shimmer above the stovepipe and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. Not happy exactly. Not certain. Just, this room is warm and it will continue to be warm as long as I feed it. And that is something I can do, and I know how to do it, and nobody can take that from me. She had been sleeping on an army cot she bought from a thrift store in Burlington for $12, against the south wall under the window that looked out at the hayfield and the stone wall. She had a wool blanket and a headlamp and 3 library books on historic building renovation that she'd checked out from the Addison County Library in Middlebury, where the librarian had given her a card the same day she applied for it, because Addison County had exactly the kind of library that gave you a card the same day. She had been reading the books in the evenings by the light of a battery lantern, making notes in a spiral notebook she bought at Owen's General Store. She had been eating from a camp stove she set on the brick hearth beside the potbelly. She had been washing in the creek with water she heated on the stove until the plumber came, which the plumber had agreed would happen in 3 weeks. The walls were mostly bare studs now, 23 containers empty. The money in a bank account she'd opened at the branch in Burlington the same week she found it. She had driven to the bank in Vera's Subaru and sat across from a woman in a gray blazer who had looked at the cashier's check from the currency and coin dealer, and the cash she'd counted twice, and said very neutrally, "That's a significant deposit." "Yes," Lena had said. "Do you have any questions about your account?" "No," Lena had said. She had walked out onto Main Street in Burlington with $29,700 in a checking account in her name and had stood on the sidewalk in the October wind and thought Marion sent some of this to Ruth in 1952. Marion helped build something here. She had not spent any of it, not yet. Owen came by one Saturday afternoon with a bag of apples from his orchard. He stood in the open doorway and looked at the room for a long time. The bare studs on the walls, the cleared floor, the stove glowing in the corner, the old school desk pushed to one side, cleaned and waiting. He ran his hand along the surface of the nearest desk. "Ruth always said this building had more life in it," he said. "She used to come by in the summers after the county closed it, just to check on it." He picked up an apple from the bag and set it on the teacher's desk at the front of the room. "I thought she was being sentimental. Maybe she was. Maybe." He looked at the chalkboard, at the date still written there from 56 years ago. Maybe she was right. He left the bag of apples on the windowsill. He came back the following Saturday with a woman named Nell, who made braided rugs in her farmhouse up the road and who wanted to donate one to the schoolhouse because, as she put it, bare floors in November are not a Vermont tradition. The rug was red and blue and made from strips of wool that had been dyed by hand in her kitchen, and it went in front of the potbelly stove where the students' feet had worn the floorboards smooth. A farmer named Ed brought a rocking chair his father had built. He set it next to the stove without saying anything about it. The people of Aldenvale came slowly, the way small-town people came carefully with things, as if they needed something to hold while they decided whether to trust. And then Nelson Calloway knocked on the door. She heard his car first. Not the way she heard Vera's Subaru, which had a familiar rumble that she'd come to associate with coffee and steadiness. This was a different car, larger, newer, the sound of something that cost more than it needed to and knew it. He was 58 years old with the look of a man who had made most of his decisions by calculation rather than instinct, not cruel, not warm, precise in the way of someone who had learned that precision was power. He came in without being invited, looked around the room, the bare studs, the stove, the school desks, the rug, the rocking chair. He looked at all of it with the expression of someone conducting an inventory. "Miss Marsh," not a question. "Yes," she said. She didn't put down the sandpaper she was using on the nearest desk leg. "Nelson Calloway." He reached into his coat and produced a folder. "Ruth Calloway was my aunt." Lena set down the sandpaper. He opened the folder on the teacher's desk. Documents, some recent on legal letterhead, some older photocopies, handwritten records, a survey map with notations she couldn't read from where she was standing. "My grandfather, Thomas Calloway, purchased this land in 1901, he said. He deeded it to the town for school use under a conditional deed, meaning the title remained with the Calloway family if the property stopped being used as a school." He touched the survey map. The school closed in 1968. At that point, under the terms of the original deed title, should have reverted to the Calloway estate. Lana looked at the documents. She looked at him. "The county had the building on the surplus list," she said. "The county thinks they have a lot of things they don't actually have clear title to," he said. "This is one of them." He closed the folder. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Miss Marsh. I've been aware of this situation for some time, and I haven't acted on it because the building wasn't worth anything. But now there's $29,700 involved and a deed that may not be valid." Lena was very still. "My deed. Your deed. Yes. I paid $1 for it. You paid $1 to a county that may not have had the authority to sell." He said it without apology, just flat, the way facts were flat. when someone had arranged them carefully and was delivering them on schedule. I have an attorney reviewing the original deed language now. If the conditional reverter clause is enforceable, and I believe it is, then the property belongs to the Callaway estate, which means the money belongs to the Callaway estate. Technically, the money found on the property, while the property ownership is in dispute, becomes part of that dispute. Yes. He picked up the folder. I'm giving you 30 days to resolve this before I file in county court. I thought it was the courteous thing to do. He left. The door closed behind him. Lena stood in the center of the room for a long time. The stove ticked. The maple floor creaked, once settling. The rocking chair Ed had brought sat beside the stove as if someone had just gotten up from it. Okay, stop. Think. He has documents. Some of them look real. You don't have a lawyer. You barely have furniture. You have $29,700 in the bank and a potentially worthless deed, and 30 days before a county court proceeding. She thought about what 30 days meant. She thought about whether she could spend 30 days in a schoolhouse with no resolution and still get up every morning and sand the floor and stoke the stove. She thought yes. She didn't know why exactly. She just knew that whatever Nelson Callaway had in that folder, she was not leaving before she understood what she was actually dealing with. Vera arrived 3 days later. She drove from Burlington on a Tuesday morning with her Subaru loaded with a bag of groceries and a second wool blanket, and the expression of someone who had decided something and was not changing her mind. She set the groceries on the teacher's desk. She sat down in the rocking chair beside the stove. She looked at Lena. "Tell me about Callaway," she said. Lena told her. Vera listened in the way she listened to everything, completely still, without interrupting, without the small performative noises people made to show they were engaged. When Lena finished, Vera was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. Lena waited. "I didn't tell you about this schoolhouse by accident." Vera said it carefully, not confessing, not apologizing, just stating. "When you told me your last name that first week you started at the diner, Marsh, I felt something." She paused. "Ruth told me something the day she locked the school for the last time. I was 18. I had driven out to Aldenvale to help her pack the last of her personal things. She said," another pause, "she said if I ever met someone with the name Marsh who needed a place, I should think of the schoolhouse." Lena stared at her. "She said the building would take care of whoever took care of it." Vera looked at the stove. "At the time, I thought she was being poetic. She had a tendency toward poetry, Ruth did, a slight softening around her eyes. I held on to it. You hold on to things people tell you when they're saying goodbye to something they love. You don't always know why." "How long ago was that?" 1968. Vera looked at her. 56 years ago? The schoolhouse was very quiet. "You didn't plan this," Lena said. "You didn't engineer it." "No, I had coffee at that diner every morning for 11 years, and you were just the girl who kept my mug full. Until the morning you told me your name and Ruth's voice came back from 1968 and said, 'This one. This is the one.'" She looked at her hands. "I couldn't tell you then. I wasn't sure. I'm not in the business of sending 20-year-olds into abandoned buildings based on 56-year-old instructions from my dead sister." A pause. "I drove you there and I let you look at it and I let you decide because the decision had to be yours." Lena sat down on the floor near the stove. She felt the old maple planks under her palms, cold and smooth and solid. "She left you a letter," Vera said. "Ruth. She told me there was a letter for whoever found the building. She didn't tell me what it said." She looked at Lena. "What did it say?" Lena told her. "About Marion, about the 1952 money sent for safekeeping, about Ruth's specific instruction. If Marion's family comes, they should know Marion helped sustain this work." Vera was very still for a long time. "I didn't know that," she said finally. "I knew Marion visited. I was 7 years old when she first came. I remember a woman with kind eyes who sat in the kitchen with Ruth and they talked for a long time. I was a child. I wasn't part of those conversations. I just knew it mattered because Ruth was listening the way she listened when something mattered. She looked at Lena. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about any of it. But you sent me here. I sent you here because my sister told me to. Vera paused. And because you had nowhere else to go, and I had a feeling. They sat with that for a while. The stove ticked. The October light came through the tall windows and fell across the maple floor in long gold shapes that moved slowly as the sun moved. Lena had been going through the remaining old newspapers. She had started after Nelson's visit, methodically, spreading each stack out on the floor and going through it page by page. Most of it was ordinary, agricultural news, town meeting notices, recipes, the kind of local journalism that documented the small facts of ordinary life in the way ordinary life required documenting. And then in the fourth stack, tucked between two pages from the Addison County Independent, dated March 1952, and folded in on itself so completely that it had been invisible unless you were looking for exactly this A letter, not in a container, not sealed, just folded small and flat and inserted between the newspaper pages like something someone had placed there for the specific purpose of concealment. She pulled it free. The paper was different from the newspaper, heavier, cream-colored, the kind of personal stationery that had been nicer once. The handwriting was different too, not Ruth's careful slanting hand, something quicker, more urgent. Dear Ruth, I am sending what I can. I know it isn't much. Don't put it in the bank. He goes through the statements and asks questions I don't want to answer. Put it somewhere dry and safe. The walls, if you think they'll hold. Stone buildings hold things. Theodore borrowed from my father's estate 3 years ago and has not paid it back and says he won't. There is some remaining that I have kept separate that he doesn't know about, and I want it somewhere he can't reach it until things are settled. I don't know when that will be. I may never know. I trust you with this because you are the most honest person I know, and because what you're building there in that schoolhouse is the kind of thing that deserves to keep going. When it's needed, use it. For the school, for the building, for whoever comes after. Don't save it for me. It was always meant to go somewhere good. With love, Marion. March 14th, 1952. Lena read the letter twice. Then she sat on the maple floor with it and looked at the photograph of Marion pressed flat in her rucksack against her spine and understood something she hadn't understood before. Marion hadn't just sent money to Ruth for safekeeping. Marion had been trying to save something from a man who took what didn't belong to him, from a situation she could not fully escape but could partially outmaneuver. She had taken what was hers by right money from her father's estate and had moved it somewhere Theodore couldn't reach it. She had moved it into the walls of a schoolhouse in Vermont. She had trusted Ruth to hold it, and Ruth had held it for 16 years, adding her own savings to it year by year until 1968, when she sealed the letter in the envelope and tucked it behind the chalkboard and walked out for the last time and let the building hold it for whoever came next. Marion Marsh had spent her life trying to protect something from a man who felt entitled to it. Lena Marsh had spent her life trying to protect something from a man who felt entitled to it. The names were different. The shape of the thing was identical. She put the letter carefully in the folder with Ruth's letter and the newspaper page with the photograph. She pressed her hand over the folder. 3 documents, 3 pieces of a chain that had been building for 72 years, link by link, woman by woman, in the spaces that men like Theodore and Garrett and Nelson Calloway had not thought to look. Nelson filed with the county court the week before his deadline, which was 3 days earlier than he'd promised, but Lena had stopped being surprised by people who said one thing and did another. The filing came in the mail. She sat on the floor of the schoolhouse with the legal document in her hands. The stove was burning. The nail rug was under her feet. The rocking chair was empty. The old school desks were clean now, lined up facing the chalkboard, which still said June 4th, 1968. She had $29,700 in the bank. Nelson Calloway had an attorney and a conditional reverter clause from 1901, and the presumption of a man who had always believed that what he was owed would eventually come to him. She could write him a check. She could write him a check right now, and it would cover whatever settlement he was likely to accept, and she would still have money left, and she could find another building somewhere and start over, and nobody would bother her, and nobody would send her legal documents in the mail. She sat with that possibility for a long time. The stove ticked. The maple floor was cold under her, even through the rug. November was coming. She could feel it in the way the old building breathed, adjusting itself against the temperature change, the timbers contracting slightly in the night and expanding slightly in the midday warmth. She looked at the photograph of Marion. She had set it up on the teacher's desk after she found Marion's letter, propped it against the chalk tray where the students could have seen it from their desks if there had been students. Marion Marsh had been a teacher in New Hampshire in the 1950s. Marion Marsh had hidden money in the walls of this schoolhouse in Vermont. Marion Marsh had trusted Ruth Calloway to hold what she couldn't hold herself, and Ruth had held it for 16 years and then left it in the walls for 40 more, and somehow all of that had come down to this Lena Marsh, 20 years old, sitting on the maple floor of a one-room schoolhouse with a legal document in her hands and a checking account and a choice. Write the check. Be done. Start somewhere else, or don't. She set the legal document on the teacher's desk. She set it next to Marion's photograph. She looked at both of them. Marion hadn't walked away from what was hers. Marion hadn't been able to walk away, not fully, not from everything Lena understood, that understood the complicated weight of situations you couldn't simply exit. But Marion had protected what she could, had moved what she could move to safer ground, had trusted what she could trust. This was safer ground. This was the place Marion had trusted. Lena picked up the legal document. She folded it in half and put it in the folder with the other three. She stood up. She walked to the chalkboard. She picked up one of the pieces of chalk from the tray. She wrote below the date from 1968, still standing. She set the chalk down. She went to stoke the stove. Outside, the last of the maple leaves were coming down off the big tree beside the schoolhouse, orange and gold, drifting sideways in the November wind and settling on the stone step and the stone wall and the gravel path in a layer so thick and bright it looked like something the tree had been saving up all summer to give. Lena watched them come down from the window. She thought, I need Owen. Not to fight Nelson for her, not to do what she couldn't do, just to help her find what was already there. Somewhere in 40 county record books and 80 years of property filings, Marion Marsh had left something. Ruth had known about it. The letter said so. Marion helped sustain this work. You didn't sustain something without a record. You didn't sustain something without leaving a trace. You didn't do any of this and then disappear completely. She put on her coat. She was going to Owen's general store to find out exactly what Marion Marsh had left behind in the official records of Addison County, Vermont, in a year when she had still been alive and still had the ability to make something official and put it somewhere that a man named Theodore could not reach it, and a man named Nelson would eventually have to reckon with. The November wind came off the mountains, cold and clean and completely indifferent to everything that wasn't the work immediately in front of you. Lena walked out of the schoolhouse and down the gravel path and toward town. The leaves came down behind her, orange and gold, settling on the stone step. The stove continued to burn inside. Part 3. What the Walls Kept. Owen's filing system was not strictly speaking a system. It was more of a philosophy. Things were arranged by approximate decade and general category, and the principle that Owen had always been able to find what he needed when he needed it, which was less a filing system and more a feat of memory that Owen had apparently been performing for 30 years without incident. Land records, he said, back here. The back room of Owen's general store was a small room behind the hardware display, lit by a single bulb with wooden shelves along all four walls and cardboard boxes labeled in Owen's handwriting with a black marker. Most of the boxes contained what you'd expect: sales records, inventory logs, the administrative sediment of running a small-town general store for decades. But along the north wall were county record volumes, old ones, the kind that the county had microfilmed at some point and then left the originals here because it was a small county and Owen had always been willing to be the town clerk and the general store was close enough to the town hall. What year? Owen said. 1959? Lena said. Marion Marsh, a contribution to something called the School Building Fund. Owen ran his finger along the spines of the volumes on the bottom shelf. He pulled out a volume bound in green cloth, worn at the corners, hand-labeled on the spine, Addison County Land and Institutional Records, 1955 to 1962. He set it on the table. Lena opened it. It was a ledger, handwritten entries one after another in the bureaucratic script of whoever had been the county record keeper in those years. Property transfers, deed registrations, institutional accounts, the kind of documentation that nobody read unless they had a specific reason and which had been sitting on Owen's shelf for 60 years undisturbed because nobody had had a specific reason until now. She turned pages, slowly, carefully. The pages were brittle at the edges and the ink had faded to brown in places, and she was looking for two words, Marion Marsh, in 120 pages of entries, and she found them on page 74, not where she expected, not under land transfer, not under property deed, under institutional contributions, Addison County Educational Fund, 1959. The entry read Marion Marsh Concord, N.H., contribution to Aldenvale School Building Maintenance Fund. Amount $400, notarized, witnessed, and recorded in accordance with the Institutional Fund Charter dated 1902, signed Marion E. Marsh. Two witnesses, both with Addison County addresses, both notarized. Lena read it 3 times. Then she looked at Owen. Owen looked at the entry. He said, She said, what does that mean? It means, he said slowly, the way he said things when he was working out the full implication while speaking, that Marion Marsh of Concord, New Hampshire, made a legally recorded institutional contribution to the Aldenvale School Maintenance Fund in 1959. He looked at her, which is not the same as owning the land, but it is documented evidence of a legal, financial, and institutional connection to this specific building that predates Nelson Calloway's claim. That's not how the law works precisely. But it creates a recorded legal interest in the property that a court would have to consider. He looked at the entry again, and it's a notarized witness document from 1959, not a letter from 1968, not a conditional reverter clause from 1901 that nobody has enforced in 60 years. He closed the volume. It also raises questions about what a conditional reverter clause means when a third party with a documented institutional interest has been contributing to the building's maintenance. Can Nelson still pursue this? He can try. Owen looked at her steadily. He probably won't. He was right. Nelson Calloway's attorney called Owen's office, which was also the general store, on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Lena had found the entry in the record book. Owen told Lena about the call that afternoon. Nelson was withdrawing the filing. His attorney had said very precisely that in reviewing the historical record, the question of clear title to the property was more complex than initially assessed, and that the Calloway estate had decided not to pursue the matter further at this time. At this time, which was the kind of language that covered its retreat carefully and left a door theoretically open. Lena didn't care about the theoretical door. What she cared about was that Nelson Calloway was not getting the schoolhouse. What she cared about was that Marion Marsh had put her name on a notarized document in 1959, and nobody had known it was there until now, and it had waited in Owen's filing room for 65 years and had done exactly what it was supposed to do. She sat on the stone step in front of the schoolhouse after Owen told her, and she put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just pressing her palms against her eyes and breathing in and breathing out and letting the knowledge settle into her the way cold water settled into stone, slowly and completely and permanently. The people of Aldenvale came after that, not all at once, the way they always came to things, carefully with things, like they needed to bring something in their hands before they could bring themselves. Nell came back with a second braided rug. Will came with a bag of potatoes from his cellar. He left them on the porch without knocking, which was the Vermont way of giving something without asking for acknowledgement. A woman named Grace, who lived 3 miles up the road, came with a box of mason jars she had canned herself, tomatoes and green beans and apple butter, and something labeled only winter squash soup. An elderly couple named the Bryans came together one afternoon. Their children had been among Ruth's last students, the final class before the school closed in 1968. They had a photograph, black and white, printed on the thick paper of that era, slightly curled at the corners. Ruth Calloway stood at the chalkboard. The entire class was looking up at her. 12 children ages 6 to 14 seated at their desks with their hands on the surfaces and their faces turned toward the front of the room with that concentrated attention that children produced when something genuinely interested them. Ruth was pointing at the map of the world on the wall, the same map that was still tacked to the wall, now yellowed and curling at the corners, the same map. Lena hung the photograph beside the chalkboard. On the other side from Marion's photograph, 2 women in the same room across 60 years, both of them pointing at something worth knowing. Then Claire called. It was a Tuesday evening and Lena was on the floor sanding the last section of baseboard near the pot-belly stove when her phone rang. Unknown number, Burlington area code. She didn't answer it. It called again 30 seconds later. She answered. Lena, her mother's voice. Flat, careful, the voice of someone who had been practicing this and was hoping the practice was enough. Lena said nothing. I read the article in the Burlington paper, Claire said, about the schoolhouse, about the money in the walls. Okay, Lena said. I wanted a pause. I wanted you to know I read it. Okay. What is happening right now? What is this? Her mother was not apologizing. She was not asking to come visit. She was not promising to leave Garrett or explaining herself or asking for anything. She was saying, I read about you in the newspaper and I wanted you to know, which was not much, which was also in the limited vocabulary of what her mother could say something. I'm good, Lena said, which was the truest thing she could say without turning the call into something neither of them knew how to survive. I know, Claire said. I can tell from the article. A pause. I know what I did, Claire said. I stood at the window. Lena said nothing. I just wanted you to know. I know. Another pause. I didn't know about your grandmother Marion, Claire said. She died before I could ask her much. She and I didn't. She stopped. We had a difficult time. I know, Lena said. She would have. Claire's voice changed briefly, very briefly. She would have been very glad about the schoolhouse. Lena was quiet for a moment. I'll send you the Burlington article, Claire said, if you want to have it. Okay, Lena said. Okay. A pause. I won't call again unless you say to. I'll let you know, Lena said. Okay. She hung up, Vera was sitting in the rocking chair by the stove. She had been there while Lena was on the phone, not listening or not appearing to listen, which was one of the things about Vera that Lena had come to rely on. She could be present without intruding. She could fill a room without taking it up. "My mother," Lena said. "I know." Lena sat back on her heels. "She said she knows what she did." "Is that enough?" Lena thought about it. The way you thought about things that didn't have clean answers. The way you sat with the shape of something before deciding what it was. "Not yet," she said. "But it's something." Vera looked at the stove. "It's a beginning," she said. Lena went back to the baseboard. She finished sanding by lamplight, her hands moving in the slow back and forth that had become as automatic as breathing, and she thought about Marion and Ruth and the weight of things that women protected for each other across distances they couldn't cross in ways that the people they were protecting from never thought to look. The teacher's desk was the last thing she cleaned. She had been avoiding it a little, not consciously, the way you avoided the most important thing until you were ready. It was a solid oak desk, the kind that had been made to last. Double pedestals, 3 drawers on each side, the surface worn smooth in the center from decades of grading papers and writing lesson plans and resting arms during the particular exhaustion of teaching 12 children simultaneously across 8 grade levels with nothing but chalk and attention and patience. She cleaned the surface first, then the drawers which held the chalk and the grade book and the bell and nothing else. Nothing she hadn't already found. She was about to stop when her rag caught on something under the left side bottom drawer, not on the drawer itself, on the underside of the desk below the drawer where the frame met the pedestal, a rough edge, like something taped down and then forgotten about, and the tape gone brittle with age. She crouched, looked. An envelope, taped to the underside of the desk with tape that had gone amber and mostly detached, but had held mostly through 56 Vermont winters. A small envelope, the cream-colored stationery kind, lighter weight than the envelopes in the legal folder. She pulled it free. The tape came away in strips. On the front of the envelope in the handwriting, she now recognized the one that was quicker and more urgent than Ruth's careful slant. The handwriting from the 1952 letter. 2 words. My granddaughter. No name, no date, just my granddaughter. Lena sat down on the maple floor with her back against the teacher's desk. She held the envelope for a long time. The stove ticked. The lamplight fell warm and steady across the floor. Outside, the first real snow of the year had started coming down. She could hear it just barely, the faint hiss of flakes against the glass of the tall windows. She opened the envelope. 2 pages, the same cream-colored stationery, written in front and back on each page, the writing smaller than the 1952 letter, more controlled, as if whoever was writing this had more time and less urgency and was choosing each word deliberately. My granddaughter. I don't know your name yet. I don't know if you've been born yet. But Ruth and I have discussed this, and we both believe that if anyone is going to come to this schoolhouse and understand what it is, it will be someone from my family. It might be one of Claire's children, or it might be someone I haven't imagined yet. Whoever you are, you found this, which means the building held, which means Ruth was right about it. I want you to know a few things about what this place is. I put money in these walls because I had a husband who took things that weren't his and believed, as certain men believed, that whatever was in his reach was his by right. I couldn't protect everything. I couldn't even protect myself entirely, but I could move some things to ground he couldn't reach. Stone buildings are hard to argue with. I chose Ruth because she was honest. She was also practical about things, which is not the same as being cold. She was very warm, Ruth was, but she understood that a promise you make in a room full of feeling can sometimes outlast the feeling if the room is solid enough. This room is solid. The walls are solid. The slate roof will last another 100 years if nobody drops a tree on it. I know you are going to wonder why I didn't leave this to your mother. Claire was very young when I made these arrangements, and later when she was grown, we had a difficult time between us. I don't blame Claire entirely. I blame the circumstances, and I blame myself for some of it. I wasn't always easy to know. I had a tendency to hold things in until there was no room left for anything else, and the people closest to me sometimes bore the weight of that. If Claire had a daughter, I hope she had her grandmother's sense of direction. I hope she had the ability to find her way toward the right thing when everything else was pointing somewhere else. I hope she has Ruth's stubbornness and my patience, and something neither of us had, which is the ability to sit in a difficult room and not leave before it becomes what it's supposed to be. If you're reading this, you haven't left. That's everything. There's money in the walls, or there was, and you found it, and now you have to decide what to do with it. Ruth will have left a letter. She said she would. Read it first if you haven't already. She says it better than I could. I want to say one more thing. The work of protecting things is quiet work. It doesn't get noticed while it's happening. It doesn't get celebrated. You do it in the margins, in the spaces that other people overlook, in the hours before anyone else is awake. You tuck things into walls. You sign documents that nobody reads until 60 years later. You write letters to granddaughters who don't exist yet and leave them taped to the bottom of a desk. It looks like nothing. It is not nothing. Your grandmother loved you before she knew you. Marion. Lena set the letter down on the maple floor. She sat with both palms flat on the wood. The snow was coming down outside. She could see it now through the tall windows, the flakes large and slow in the lamplight, drifting past the glass and settling on the stone step and the stone wall and the bare arms of the sugar maple. The stove ticked. The pressed tin ceiling held the heat and radiated it back down. The desks stood in their rows. The map of the world was on the wall. The photograph of Ruth pointing at that map. The photograph of Marion with chalk dust on her fingers. She pressed her palms harder on the floor, not crying. She had spent 20 years conserving herself for situations that required being intact. She was intact. She would stay intact. But her face was wet. She didn't know when that had happened. She folded Marion's letter carefully and put it in the folder with the others. Ruth's letter, Marion's 1952 letter, the newspaper photograph, the notarized entry from Owen's record book, 5 documents, 5 pieces of a thing that had been built in the quiet across 67 years by 2 women who understood that the best place to keep something safe was somewhere that looked empty. She stood up. She built the fire higher in the stove. She was going to have the community gathering in December. Not a class, not an event, just open doors, warm room people coming in from the November cold. Nell's rugs on the floor and Will's produce on the windowsills and the pot-belly stove burning and the chalkboard on the wall and the desks pushed to the sides to make room for people who needed to be somewhere warm. She put the word out through Owen, through Vera, through the small, informal network of Aldenvale that didn't require social media or announcements, but just needed someone to say, the schoolhouse is open on Saturday, and anyone who wants to come can come. 43 people came. Aldenvale had maybe 300 residents. A third of them came on a Saturday afternoon in December to stand in a one-room schoolhouse and drink coffee from an urn that Grace had brought and eat pie that Nell had made and look at the maple floor and the pressed tin ceiling and the old school desks and the 2 photographs on the wall and the chalkboard with the date from June 1968 still written on it, and below it, still standing. People stood near the stove and held their coffee cups in both hands the way people held things in Vermont in December. They talked in the way small-town people talked. Not loudly, not with the performance of conversation, but with the actual content of it. What had happened to the Abernethy place? Whether the river would freeze hard this year, how long the Willard family had been in the valley, the kind of talking that was really a form of being together, which was itself a form of staying. The Bryans came. She hadn't expected them. They were in their 80s, Ed and Martha Bryan, and they had driven from their farm 3 miles up the road in the December cold, and they stood in the schoolhouse and looked at the room they had looked at last when they were children and didn't say anything for a long time. Martha went to one of the desks. She sat down in it, the old-fashioned kind with the cast-iron legs and the flip-up writing surface. She was 81 years old, and she sat in a school desk and put her hands on the surface and looked at the chalkboard. Nobody said anything. The room held it. That was the thing about certain rooms, the thing certain buildings knew that modern construction had forgotten. You didn't have to do anything spectacular in them. You just had to stay. Ed stood beside his wife and put his hand on her shoulder, and they looked at the chalkboard together for a while. Then Martha put her hand over her husband's. Just that. Just the two of them standing in a room they had last stood in 60 years ago, when the hands covering each other had been small and smooth instead of weathered and patient. Owen stood near the back wall with his coffee and watched the room with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for something to start making sense. Vera sat in the rocking chair by the stove. She looked at home in it, which made sense. She was home in it. She had driven an hour to get here, but this was the place her sister had loved, and love had a way of extending its boundaries beyond where we thought it could reach. Lena moved through the room slowly, refilling coffee from the urn, setting out more of Nell's pie, answering questions about the renovation with the honesty of someone who had learned most of what she knew by doing it wrong first and then doing it right. A woman asked about the photographs on the wall. Lena told her, "Not all of it, not the whole chain. Just one of them is the teacher who was here for 22 years, and the other is my grandmother who knew her. They were friends. I think they both knew this place would matter to someone eventually." The woman looked at the 2 photographs for a long time. "That's how it works," she said finally. "People make things possible for people they'll never meet. Most of it you never find out about." Vera found Lena by the stove near the end of the afternoon. Ruth would have approved, she said. She would have had opinions about the coffee urn. She had opinions about everything. Vera looked at the room, at the people talking and eating pie and running their hands along the old desks. But yes, she would have approved. After everyone had gone home and the coffee urn was packed up and the last of the pie was wrapped in foil, on the windowsill, Lena stood alone in the schoolhouse. She stoked the stove. She picked up a piece of chalk, the chalk that had been in the cabinet beside the stove since 1968. Still good, still exactly what chalk was supposed to be. Below, still standing, she wrote, "Aldenvale Schoolhouse, reopened, December." Below that, Ruth Calloway, Marion Marsh. She stepped back and looked at what she'd written. 2 names, 2 women who had done the quiet work in the margins, in the spaces other people overlooked across 67 years to make sure that something worth keeping was kept. She picked up the chalk again. She wrote below Marion's name, and then she stopped. She stood there with the chalk in her hand. The room waited. The stove ticked. The snow fell outside. The maple floor held the lamplight and gave it back warm. The map of the world was on the wall, yellowed and curling, and still exactly where Ruth had left it. She looked at the blank space below Marion's name. Marion had written, "It is not nothing." Ruth had written, "Feed the next student who comes through the door." Both of them pointing forward. Both of them leaving the blank line for whoever came next. Both of them understanding that the chain only held if someone was willing to be the next link. She wrote one more thing, Lena Marsh, still learning. She set the chalk down. She walked to the window and looked out at the snow coming down over Aldenvale, the church steeple visible through the dark, the covered bridge, the stone walls running along the field edge under their white covering, stacked long ago by someone patient enough to believe in permanence, the sugar maple bare and still its branches holding the first inch of snow with the patience of something that had been here longer than any of this and fully expected to remain. The schoolhouse was warm behind her. The letters were in the folder on the teacher's desk. Marion was on the wall. Ruth was on the wall. They were both pointing at something worth knowing. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. Lena Marsh, 20 years old, $1, one schoolhouse, 5 documents from 3 generations of women who had done their work in the quiet so that she could do hers in the light. The glass held, the room held, she held.